What's up, class? Here we are again, week two, and hope you guys are doing well. Um, and I hope you guys are taking advantage of the random Zoom meetings that are popping up. So I'm gonna keep doing them as long as they're convenient for some students. So anyway, here we go. I'm going straight from the book. The Rise of Hollywood. Uh-oh, messing up my glasses here. All right, so around the year 1910, a number of film companies set up business in and around the small suburb of Hollywood to West Los Angeles. Within a decade, the system they created came to dominate cinema, not only in the United States but throughout the world, by concentrating production into vast factory-like studios and by vertically integrating all aspects of businesses from production to publicity to distribution to exhibition. They created model systems, the studio system, which other countries had to imitate in order to compete. So this time, 1910, we see the rise in this, the success of these studio systems, and they are here in Los Angeles because the weather is great, and you got to remember on the East Coast there are some studios, but they're kind of under the control of the MPPC. So, in 1925, or I should say by 1925, it was the Hollywood system that dominated the market. And it was as far as from Britain to Bengal, from South Africa to Norway. Hollywood had not only seized control of the majority of the world's market, but it made its product its stars. So this is the first thing this is the rising trend where they're making stars, huge stars like Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford. Excuse me. And those stars become the catalyst, the main, how can I say it? Those stars become the main product, so to speak, in the movie. Like they start to distinguish movies by the stars in it. Like people say, oh, did you see that new Charlie Chaplin movie? Oh, did you see that new such and such movie? Okay, this is the rise of that. That starts to happen here. The emergence of Hollywood as the central of all its power industry can be found in the failure of the MPPC. Remember the MPPC, they were attempting to control and monopolize the industry. And a lot of people were like, nah, we're not with that. So the independents, that they called them, they came to California and started this studio system, which was extremely efficient at making these big budget productions. The trust, I'm reading from the book now, the trust found it difficult to maintain and control in the space of a half dozen years, from 1909 to 1914. Independents such as Carl Laemmle and William Fox rose to opposition to the trust, sowing the seeds of what we know as Hollywood. Adolph Zucker put together Paramount. Mark Lowe created what was to become MGM. William Fox fashioned his movie empire. These and other independent exhibitors and movie makers differentiated their products, making longer and more complicated narratives, while the trust tended to stick with two real 15-minute short stories. So we have these two divergent type of narratives going on. The trust, which is primarily on the East Coast and in Chicago, they're maintaining these two real 15-minute sort of limit, so to speak, on the length of the film and the type of narrative. I'm sorry, not the type of narrative, but just the length on the film. But on the West Coast, You know, we're getting lit on film. We're like, let's make these epic movies. You know, so by 1912, the independents on the West Coast were producing enough films to fill theatrical bills. Each movie became a unique product. They were heavily advertised. With more than 20,000 cinemas open in the USA by 1920, the ever-increasing number of feature-length photoplays easily found an audience. A little further down, the independents also began to take control of exhibition in the USA. They did not attempt to buy up all the 20,000 movie houses. They concentrated instead on new movie palaces in the largest cities. So now we're looking at this idea of a movie palace, a place you can go to that's palace-like and watch a movie, have a different experience. Okay? By 1920, there were 2,000 picture palaces showing exclusive first runs. I'm gonna go close my window here because the gardener's coming. 1 second. Sorry about that. So by 1920s, there were 2,000 picture palaces showing exclusive first runs. An exclusive first run means that there are a certain number of movies that come out. And when a film does come out, there's a certain number of theaters. So when you have an exclusive first run, that means you've chosen a handful of theaters to premiere this movie. It's a first run deal. So the West Coast independents began to take control of exhibition in the USA. By 1920, these 2,000 palaces showing exclusive first runs were capturing over 3/4 of the revenue. That's a lot. 3/4 of the revenue were going to these palaces, these cinematic palaces in Los Angeles and around the country. So companies led by Paramount, Fox, MGM were able to collect millions of dollars per year in profit during this time. So what happens is during this period, what started off as the independent movement, right? Now, the independents have formulated this system of making movies that's so efficient. And these palaces are so successful that they become the system. Okay? That they actually become the system. So they started as a rebuttal to the system, which would have been the movement by the MPPC to control everything. And in the process of doing that, they become the system. Okay? With any one film costing up to $100,000 or more to produce, a few extra $1,000 to make prints and send them around the world proved relatively small. The worldwide popularity in turn created a demand which required non-stop production, because now the demand for U.S. cinema is worldwide. To meet this requirement, the Los Angeles basin offered year-round sunshine, long working days outdoors, and in addition to all possible combinations of locations for filming. Look, we're in Los Angeles. We got the beach, we got deserts, we got mountains, we got snow if you need it. So, and they're all accessible. And those locations can play different locations. Meaning, I can shoot in the desert of let's say by Lancaster, and trick that for the deserts of Africa. I'm just saying. Okay, an example. By the 1920s, guys, by the 1920s, this is a side note, you don't have to know this. The Hollywood system had produced such glamorous images, all right, that the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce had to take out an ad in the newspapers discouraging people from coming to Hollywood to make their dreams come true. It's crazy. People were trying to break into the movie industry so bad that they were coming to Hollywood. Hollywood had to put out an ad in a newspaper telling them don't come. All right. So around this period, we had profound changes in the production system as well. During the 1910s and early 1920s, the successful companies led by Adolph Zucker's famous player Lasky Corporation developed a system by which to manufacture popular films on a large scale. The system was much admired abroad, and film industries over the world sent their representatives over to Hollywood to study and, if possible, copy it. As well, visitors from France, Germany, Britain, Hollywood was to play host in the 1930s to the Luigi Freddi, head of the Italian fascist film industry, and to Boris Chmelnytsky, Stalin's henchman in charge of the industry in the Soviet Union. The centerpiece of the production offered by the Hollywood companies was the featured film. So now we have featured film. And it was generally 90 minutes long. It had a 10-minute newsreel or animated subject and might provide a complement. But it was the feature that sold the event. So now we have the advent of the 90-minute feature film. Remember, MTC was trying to limit it to 2 reels, which would have been 15 minutes. So on the West Coast, the success of the 90-minute feature, the success of the feature film is going global. You got people coming to Hollywood to study this production system that Adolph Zucker had developed, basically to churn out several of these feature films, big money makers. The featured film had to be a story of unusual interest, produced a cost of about $100,000, sometimes up to $500,000. Okay. Ironically, the inspiration for some of these films was from Europe. So these films started drawing huge audiences. And they were like, these films, these featured films, were drawing huge audiences. Moving on here, in less than 2 decades, the movie industry moved from selling movies as a novelty to developing finely honed publicity machines to promote entire system and a nationally advertised product. So they developed these publicity machines, right, to promote these films worldwide. Hollywood centered its promotional efforts on the star system, meaning they were boistering up these films by promoting these stars. Publicists had to acquire the art of manipulating new techniques of mass advertising and mass communication to create something special in the minds of the growing middle-class public. Stars provided an effective means of differentiating feature films. Remember, I was talking about people saying, oh, that Charlie Chaplin film or that Mary Pickford film. That's by design. Others at this time were plucking their stars, their legit from the stage. Adolph Zucker pioneered his famous company at this time, the Famous Players. So we had stars coming from stage. Zucker, he saw the need to develop his own stars and not just simply buy up already established names. So that's what he started doing, developing their own stars. And one in particular, Mary Pickford, was hugely successful. I mean, he was like her. She was like his. Sorry, she was his poster child, so to speak. His project, I guess, for lack of a better word, that he would take to a higher level. Pickford saw her salary increase from $100 a week in 1909 to $10,000 a week in 1917. and Zucker made her the biggest star of the day. So, moving on. United Artists achieved great success with several different films of the day at this time. Um, but United Artists was an anomaly. The standard Hollywood system of feature filmmaking sought to guarantee the shipment of attractive films to theaters on a weekly basis, and studios developed efficient and cost-effective production methods to produce films that filled theaters. And this factory system would so they basically they made it a factory system, you guys, to churn out these films on a weekly basis. And this is United Artists. So there have been, in the days before the featured film, there have been two methods of production. For reality subjects, a camera operator would journey to the subject, record the action, and then edit it together. For films inspired by vaudeville acts and literary sources, the movie companies employed a director to stage scenes and a camera and a camera operator to record them. Gradually, during the 1910s, the demand for narrative films increased. Specialists were trained to assist the director to make movies faster. Writers thought up storylines, scenic artists painted backgrounds, and okay. So you had the documentary style of filmmaking, and they would send the cameraman out. The cameraman would shoot it, come back, they would process the film, develop it, and then edit it. Now, with films inspired by the vaudeville acts or taken from literary sources, it was a different process. They started getting directors to come in and stage, place objects, people in various positions, set up the scene, shoot it, have writers come in, write it, shoot it with dialogue, and really set it up. Okay? This is the days before the feature film. Okay. Okay. Another point. I'm on page 48. The Hollywood production system was not invented, but evolved in response to a number of felt imperatives, of which the most important was the need for regular and consistent profit. So they had to keep making money to sustain these studios that they were creating. Thomas Inc. was an ascribed producer, and he worked at Mutual in 1913. The standard studio working procedures that we use were devised by Inc. involved a studio boss, the film's director, and a continuity script. Once Inc. as head producer had approved the project, he assigned available buildings for filming and commissioned writers and production artists to create the necessary script, set, and costumes. Backup systems such as internal police force to keep out the crowds or firefighting to assist when the wooden set burned meant that in early 1920s, studio lots covered many acres operating. Okay, so they knew that they needed to churn out these films weekly to keep their audience satisfied, and not just to keep it satisfied, but to sustain their own pockets. So, in Inc.'s system, it involved a studio boss. The studio boss would greenlight a project, meaning give it the thumbs up, the go, and then he would assign a building, a studio on the lot. That's the term for a studio, a lot. The physical acreage, they call it the lot or a lot. They would assign a building on the lot to that movie as a set, and that set would serve as all the different locations of contained within that film. They would assign writers, director, artists, production artists, painters, anyone what's called the below the line would get assigned at this time. Okay. And that's what the system that Inc. devised. This studio factory production system. But it was Adolph Zucker. I'm reading off page 48. If Inc. pioneered his Hollywood studio factory production system, it was Adolph Zucker who taught Hollywood how fully and properly to exploit it. By 1921, Zucker had fashioned the largest film company in the world, his famous 5 Players. Five years earlier, he merged 12 producers and distributors, Paramount, to form the famous Players-Lasky Corporation. In 1917, his new company included stars such as Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Gloria Swanson, Pauline Frederick, and Blanche Sweet. 2 years later, about the time Pickford and Fairbanks left to United Artists, a quarter of the cinemas in the U.S. were regularly presenting famous players. So, it wasn't enough for them to it wasn't enough for this handful of companies to control all the movie stars in theaters. So what did they do? They expanded their markets beyond the U.S. They established distribution around the world. The first border to establish distribution around the world, U.S. was the first border to establish distribution around the world. The First World War offered the crucial opening while other national cinemas were constrained, right? The leading Hollywood companies moved to make the world their marketplace. Although companies' average cost for Hollywood features of the day rarely ranged beyond $500,000, expanding distribution across the globe meant revenues regularly topped $1 million. That's a good return on your money. Okay. The Picture Palace. The modern day movie palace era commenced. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm on page 50 now. I moved on to page 50. On the bottom, the Picture Palace. The modern movie palace era commenced in 1914 with Samuel Roxy Rothafell's opening of the 3,000-seat Strand in 1914 in New York. Roxy combined a live vaudeville show with his movies. The movie palace itself was far more than just a theater. The splendor of the architecture and the touch of class led to the ubiquitous ushers evoked a high-class fantasy land. So now this guy Roxy has taken this idea of the palace to the extreme. He's got vaudeville acts opening up for movies, orchestras, and these huge palatial-like theaters. Roxy was never able to sustain his economic enterprise and sold out. So you have other people coming in like Balaban and Katz. Okay, but here's what's important. The architecture of the movie palace insulated the public from the outside world and provided an opulent stage for entertainment. Most of the features described could be easily copied from any theater chain willing to make the necessary investment, but one part of Balaban and Katz show, however, was unique. Balaban and Katz offered the first air-conditioned movie theater. Think about that. It's hot, sweltering hot in the summer, and you have an opportunity to escape that heat for a few hours just by going to the movie theater. Now, this made a big draw for their theaters, and it gave rise to what we now have, the summer blockbuster, right? Straight from the book. because of the air condition, right? Soon summer began the peak movie going season with its 5-part strategy, location, architecture, service, stage show, and air condition. That was the strategy of these big theaters. Balaban and Katz set the scene for redefining of movie going experience in the USA. The rest of the world followed cautiously, adopting or adapting some features of the new systems as circumstances permitted. So people were now emulating Balaban and Katz with these palatial cinemas around the world. Moving on to the next one. The worldwide spread of cinema on page 53. The worldwide spread of cinema has been dominated by the distribution and exhibition of Hollywood movies, despite the fact that film production has taken place around the world since the turn of the century. So we have films going on around the world, but it's the U.S. films that are dominating the market. At the turn of the century, motion picture production was essentially a cottage industry accessible to any enthusiastic entrepreneur with the modicum and the capital and know-how. The world's first feature film of over an hour's duration was made not by France or America, but in Australia. It was the story of the Kelly Gang, and it was produced in 1906. So Australia beat us to it. Moving on. I'm moving on at the bottom of page 53. Hollywood's rise to dominance. If there was little early sign of America's future dominance in the foreign field, it's the streamlining of American industries, business organizations in its home market. They were laying down the foundation of its economic strength in the first 15 years of the century. The motion picture market within the United States was and has maintained by far the most lucrative in the world. So that's the early turn of the century. By 1916, I'm moving on, 57, page 57, I'm sorry. By 1916 and 1918, the extent of the American industry represented overseas increased markedly. Some companies preferred to sign agents overseas to act on their behalf, while others formed subsidiary branches to handle foreign distribution. So they're really expanding between 1916 and 1918 into this idea of foreign distribution. Throughout the silent period, the American industry received assistance in its foreign operations from the Department of State and Commerce. U.S. consular officers cooperated in gathering a wealth of information relevant to motion picture trade, including audience preferences, conditions affecting exhibition, and activities of competitors. So the U.S., the government, knew the power of film, not just as an economic source, but later when the war starts, as a propaganda machine. So they're watching in these early years. They are watching this industry. Because it's spreading around the world, which is good for us, the U.S., because it's created this global industry. But around this time, we start to get the rise of what's called protectionism. And this is on page 58. While Hollywood's flair for the unofficial advertising may have won its friends amongst popular audiences and the U.S. Congress, it also stirred up opposition to the American product amongst foreign governments. So people around the world were so googly-goo over U.S. films that other governments were like concerned. Like why does America have so much power over this powerful industry, film industry? In 1927, the British government expressed concern that only 5% of the films shown in Britain in the British Empire were of Empire origin, while the vast majority were American. And those films reflected American values, not British values. So what did the British do? The Parliament inquiry concluded that the Empire would be better served by films reflecting their values and products of an imperial stamp. So they started this argument about American culture, being the most pervasive and dominant one that's being portrayed in the film industry. They made a requirement that Empire Films should be afforded a certain minimum amount of screen time in Britain, and Britain raised the possibility that countries throughout the empire would benefit first throughout the exhibition of their films in the British Isles, and secondly through their mutual distribution throughout the other countries of the empire. In practice, however, this arrangement favored the products of the highly capitalized British industry and did very little to boost production in other countries. The empire countries remained overwhelmingly dependent upon imported films, most of which were American. All right, I'm going to end that right here. And yes. No, I'm sorry. One more section to talk about. I'm sorry. We're looking at the First World War and the crisis in Europe. And in the summer of 1914, witnessed the opening of the Panama Canal, the start of production on D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, and the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Australia. Each of these events in its own way would tangibly influence the course of film history. The canal, the Panama Canal, would stimulate the development of the U.S. shipping industry, providing the film industry with an infrastructure for greater international distribution. So you have to when you make a film, you want to distribute it, you actually have to physically take that film canister or canister of film to the theater. Now it's different. We can download it. A theater can download a digital movie, but when you're back then we were dealing with film, someone had to take that canister. So the Panama Canal, when it opened up, the shipping routes no longer had to go all the way around South America. They can cut through Panama, which is greatly influenced and the reach of the American film distribution. Okay. D.W. Griffith's film would contribute to the transformation of film production practices and distribution techniques, all of which helped the U.S. industry triumph over its European competitors. So D.W. Griffith comes and he's making this huge, epic film, Birth of a Nation. If you haven't seen it, it's a very racist film, and it talks about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in America. Its content is racist, but it's still, despite that, it still holds a place in cinematic history because of the production practices and what D.W. Griffith, how he told his story. Okay. The third event was the Archduke Ferdinand's fate triggered the Great War when he was assassinated. It realigned the global political economy and helped to destroy the once internationally prominent film industries of France, England, and Italy. So once those industries were destroyed, guess who's there to move in? The U.S. In broad terms, the pre-1914 domination of international film production and distribution by the French and Italians gave way in 1918 to expansionist interests of the U.S. studios and a very different vision of cinema. The war not only disrupted the trade patterns so crucial to the traditional European powers, it also exacted a heavy price in terms of lives, materials, and ongoing experimentation so vital to film production. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Yeah. All right, guys. So remember when you take your quiz to keep writing down your answers and the correct answers for your study guide. And press on. All right.